Hello, everyone, and thanks for checking out Everyday Short Stories Chapter 3. This month's theme was family. Leanna contacted me and was excited to tell her story. Unbeknownst to me, she didn't know the theme and ended up telling a story not exactly family themed, but nonetheless a lot of fun. Check it out.
No idea that the theme was family. So, because I just contacted David today and it said, I could do a story. Actually, I'm going to read it, but I'll read it with feeling. And he said, that's fine. And he didn't tell me it had anything to do with family. So, this story has nothing to do with family. It's called Lost and Found in Borneo. Racked by my growing emotional dependence on a smartphone, which generates the daily drivel of personal news and little blurts of dopamine spiked text messages, I sensed my own spiritual exhaustion and booked a flight to Borneo. All I knew was that it would be really far away. The few remaining orangutans of the world would be swinging through a dense jungle, and the descendants of yesteryear's headhunters might welcome me into their villages. Initially, it felt foolhardy to search for the remote in 21st century Borneo. My first stop, Kuala Lumpur, a giant of a city on peninsular Malaysia, was plugged into the max. People watched movies on their digital pads while riding the subways, and everyone was texting. Moreover, they were absolutely shameless about it. Groups of friends would meet for coffee and text and post to Facebook rather than talk to each other. Once I flew to the island of Borneo, which encompasses more of Malaysia, the tiny state of Brunei, and a large portion of Indonesia, I expected the thick jungle would obliterate any possibility of digitally enabled global interface. Hardly. While gearing up my trekking chops at Mulu National Park, which sports amazing caves replete with zillions of bats and thick jungle trails, I quickly discovered a Wi-Fi hotspot at the Parque Cafe. Several times a day, I'd land there to post photos of my jungle and spelunking discoveries on Facebook. Within seconds, if the time zones were aligned with North America, I'd collect likes from my Facebook family. Hey, there is something about family. Being on a solo adventure, these likes did help to make my day. Sensing that Mulu was largely a tourist destination and that my goal had been remote, I made my way to Barrio, the gateway to the Kelabit Highlands. The flight to Barrio was on a very small plane, so delicate that I and my baggage had to be weighed to assure a safe glide through the sky. Upon arrival at the Barrio airstrip, I was met by my host Stephen, a full-blood Kelabit. His English was a bit halting, and his home was rustic beautiful. It appeared to be handmade with longhouse-style open hallways, adorned with exquisitely creative paintings and sculpture. He lived between centuries, habiting the life of a wild boar hunter, a jungle guide, and an internationally exhibited artist. I told him I wanted to trek somewhere remote. His aunt was an anthropologist, like I am, and he sensed my need to get lost and suggested I go to the village of Palungan. Offering me a series of hand-drawn maps to photograph onto my cell phone, he drove me to the stretch of road where Barrio's pavement ends. Before me was a super muddy expanse, almost too muddy for a four-wheel drive truck. He handed me a walking stick and suggested it would take about 3 hours to get to the village. Once there, I could ask for his friend David, who could host me for the night. The mud was unbelievable. So thick it would grab my boots, making it nearly impossible to dislodge my footsteps. For a short while, I happily followed the notations on Stephen's sweet maps, noting where the trail diverged from the muddy road. Soon I approached a stream crossing with strategically placed planks of wood. I steadied a foot on a plank, and my boot completely submerged into the cool, pungent water. Surrendering to sloshy socks, I trudged through more boot-gripping mud. Next, I found myself on a rickety handmade bridge. Attempting to steady myself, I grabbed the rails. They literally crumbled in my palms, revealing the extreme hunger of jungle termites. Eventually, I became immune to water, mud, and buzzy insects. My sole objective was not to break bones or strain muscles. The sun began to fall off the horizon as the battery on my phone weakened. I could no longer decipher Stephen's hand-drawn maps. I noted an abandoned thatched hut and wondered if I should crawl inside and wait until morning to continue my trek. I brought no food and just limited water. Palungon seemed to be far in the distance, so distant relative to my slow, careful pace that I began to sense I would not get there by nightfall. Trepidatiously, I trudged ahead. Monkeys bounced through the trees as a nighttime symphony of insects crescendoed. Then, out of nowhere, David appeared. He'd received a text message from Stephen, and they'd both gotten worried about me. I felt like giving him the biggest hug on the planet, but keeping my cool, I simply thanked him for coming out to find me. He placed my small knapsack on his back and offered me his steady hand. Suddenly, I shifted from a focused jungle woman who would outwit the challenges of a mud-wrenched terrain and fierce-sounding insects to a femme fatale. Surrendering to his superior judgment, he guided me across more rickety bridges and lots more mud until eventually, in the dark of night, we arrived at his home. He suggested I bathe, which involved throwing cold buckets of water on bloody, leech-bitten skin. I gingerly removed my mud-soaked boots, gaiters, and jeans, and then splashed my hot jungle scarred face with water. Inside, I was offered dinner, which included the wild boar he'd just caught, vegetables he'd foraged in the jungle, as well as locally grown rice. Afterwards, his family watched an Indonesian drama on satellite TV, listened to pop music stored on their pads and phones, and discussed the finer points of email and texting. I faced that even remote Palungon, which is home to just 20 households, very much habits the 21st century. Every home has a backyard generator and satellite television. Ultimately, David's family participates in a mixed economy, which includes hunting, gathering jungle vegetables, farming rice, raising chickens, and hosting and or guiding trekkers like me. Exhausted and a bit traumatized from my trek, I spent the next day wandering around the small village, taking pictures and asking a playful series of anthropological questions. That evening, I landed my all-time favorite conversation while seated around a barbecue spit where yet another wild boar was being seared. Between gulps of canned beer and chunks of wild boar, a 52-year-old man began to ask me questions. How old am I? Where's my husband? How many children do I have? Grandchildren? As he compared my answers to his, he was clearly winning, with 5 children to my 1 stepdaughter and 9 grandchildren to my 1 grandson. Enjoying his glee and the insight into his worldview, I refrained from asking him how many students he taught over the last 30 years, how many books and articles he published, and how many Google hits a search on his name produces. From chatting with several of the women, I found out that women typically get between the village and the town of Borneo by boat. Nursing several nasty leech bites, I promised myself that at all costs I would return the following day by boat. Certainly, 1 solo trek like that in a lifetime was plenty. Then morning came, and David told me I ought to get onto the trail early. It was the first day of the rice harvest, and no one with a boat would be traveling back to Borneo. Another horrendous solo trek loomed into the immediate distance. Trying to be a good sport, I put on my still wet jeans, still wet socks, and laced on my uselessly dry gaiters. I filled my water bottle, packed a lunch of wild boar fried rice wrapped in a banana leaf, and requested that David guide me to the trailhead. I began to convince myself that it wouldn't be that bad. I was leaving early in the morning. There would be plenty of daylight. Moreover, I knew the trail. Certainly there would be no surprises. Considering that it had rained hard the night before, the trail was extra muddy. To avoid getting my boots permanently lodged in the mud, I walked on the trail shoulders. After an especially muddy patch, I found myself on some decently dry paths. Eventually, I faced that these dry paths were going nowhere. I squinted at a clearing in the distance and bushwhacked ahead. The clearing was, in fact, the river. For a short while, I attempted to forge ahead and later reconnect with the main trail. It didn't work. I was truly nowhere. Stephen's hand-drawn trail maps were useless, and the map function on my cell phone required a strong Wi-Fi signal, which there wasn't. In one moment, I considered that I might write an essay about this adventure, and in the next, I realized that, daydreaming aside, I had to get myself back to the main trail. I resigned myself to attempting to retrace my footsteps. I couldn't really remember my footsteps, so I just headed away from the river and back through the jungle vines. Insects were buzzing furiously at me. In one moment, I screamed at them, and in the next, I faced that it was useless. They didn't understand. They just wanted some blood, and I was an excellent source. Bloodsuckers aside, my only recourse was to find my way back to the main trail. After 4 false starts, wherein I believed I was on a well-trodden trail, which continued to be dry, barely traversed hunter paths, I arrived on a wide, muddy trail sprinkled with carelessly tossed garbage. It was the main trail. For a moment, I considered returning to Palungon, tracking down a rice farmer, and expending whatever cash I had on a boat back to Barrio. I then gazed at the clearly marked main trail, faced that the day was in fact young, munched on a handful of wild boar fried rice, and trekked on to Barrio. I basked in getting my boots soaked all the way through, lodging in mud so thick I could barely take another step, and gingerly negotiated the rickety bridges. I knew I would make it, and I did. As I hobbled along the final stretch, the super muddy road that connects to the pavement of Barrio, a shiny 4-wheel drive truck pulled over. The driver asked where in the world was I from, and where I had trekked from that morning. He was astonished that I'd made the trek by myself, noting that women my age usually don't do such things. He then offered me a ride into Barrio. I apologized for being so very muddy. He had no problem with the mud and ushered me into the front passenger seat. Suddenly, I found myself spirited into the 21st century Borneo. That utter fear of being gobbled by leeches and hopelessly lost in a jungle so remote and foreign quickly faded into the scenery as I once again accessed the internet and posted an account of my adventure on Facebook.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching, and please don't forget to like and subscribe to this fantastic YouTube channel. Thanks. By like and subscribe, I mean, validate me, make me feel loved. So if you don't subscribe and like, then I'll know you don't love me.